Okay, may I have your attention, please? Our last speaker today is Mario Candeias. He is a co-director at the Institute of Social Analysis at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. His research focuses on the crisis of capitalism and radical strategies for social and ecological transformation. The lecture today will be an attempt to formulate conditions for the strategic reorientation of the left in the time of the global crisis. Mario, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the invitation. My first time here in Croatia. And I really, just yesterday I finished the paper and I was really astonished today that everybody speaks so well English. My English is not so well, so I had to write it down. And it will be too long, so please just stop me.
Okay. You have 45 minutes, so to an hour, don't worry about it.
Yeah, but we don't want to listen 1.5 hours and everybody fall asleep, and that's not good.
After half an hour, I'll give you a little hint.
And I changed, not the topic, but the headline, let's say, which direction to the Winter Palace? Focused on the research and the politics we did in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years since the crisis broke out. So I will focus on several countries or constellations, but leaving aside, for instance, Eastern Europe, ex-Yugoslavia and things like that, because we didn't myself did any research there, so I have to skip that, but learn from you later on. You can jump in and say what are the dilemmas over here. We just heard about Slovenia. And I also will skip today, at least, the situation in Germany. You can add this into the discussion, but we'll focus on the places where, let's say, social mobilization has really come to a point where it could be interesting for strategic as theoretical debates. Well, let's start. Triggered by the Arabellion and a series of transnational movements started, like the Indigenous, like the Occupy Wall Street, gathering pace in 2011 in Europe, in US, in Chile, and recently in Turkey and Brazil, as you all know. The events are being driven by an urban precariat that is better educated than ever before. Time and time again, spaces open up for protests and organizing, although sometimes it seems that the protest is not following the crisis as we would like to see it, but that's a regular style of protest development. As Gramsci said, it's discontinuity of the cycles. Time and time again, events underway in one place begin echoing in another, or in German we say it resonates in different places. Although it's not directly organized, it resonates in different places. This recently happened almost simultaneously in Athens, in Istanbul's Gezi Park, and in other cities throughout Turkey and in Brazil. Although this first conjuncture of protests achieved an enormous mobilization, it has also exhausted itself. The social mobilization is fizzling out, transformation seems blocked. Untouched governments and dominant groups are pressing ahead with their short-sighted austerity politics, supported by their structural and transnational power. The broad, diverse flows of civil society organizing cannot reach the solid institutions of power. We learned since the Second Women's Movement, since the anti-globalization movement, of course, since Gramsci, that civil society organizing is the key factor of transforming society. And in a way, these new movements reached a point where you can say, yeah, we did it. Some kind of, let's say, small parts of cultural hegemony are reached, but we don't reach to the solid institutions of power. That's a debate we have, for instance, with Porcaro We called it Occupy Lenin. It is published in Socialist Register and in the Review Luxembourg, if anyone would read it. And Tom this morning also mentioned some of these questions. The structural weakness of the movements: they can take the squares but not hold them. From New York to Madrid, from Cairo to Istanbul, the central camps have been swept away. In none of those cases did this spell a premature end of the movements. Given the unfavorable conditions and the extremely powerful opponents they faced, this could well have been the case, but they have not disappeared. They're still there. They have survived and they reorganized. That's the interesting thing. In doing so, they must reorient their strategy to organize and keep their eyes firmly on what once was called the headquarters of power. But first to the form of organization. The discussions around the new movements limit themselves all too often to the squares and camps, to the events unfolding in this space, this Erscheinungsraum, or the surface of appearance, where people can be talking to each other, engaging with each other. Much less attention is paid to the rhizomatic network, the vast array of vibrant relations that the squares have to other movements and organizations in society. This network gives the camps its significance, because it is here that its social impact truly comes to light, beyond the small circles of those in the camps. Sometimes we didn't understand that what is happening in the camps is not the effect of the camps. The new movement seems like a giant echo chamber or resonating cavities, initially mere empty signifiers, a cry of insurrection and a call for real democracy. They were definite and yet vague enough for different fragmented initiatives and currents to re-articulate themselves in this kind of new space. Occupying the squares created the space the isolated groups needed to step out of their individual social contexts, their niches, their scenes, and reconnect to each other. That's also an old experience, it's not completely new. Also from the second women's movement or auto-globalization movement, there was this experience, and even longer before political camps were done by several movements and even the labor movement. But again, it is a space to reconnect. Organic cooperation allowed the new movements to expand sociologically beyond their own well-educated precariat and geographically beyond the cities, and to reach to a broader body of activists and supporters. I use the Gramscian notion of organic because, maybe in contrast to Seattle 1999, these were not the tactical or strategic partnerships that exist within fully formed movements or organizations. Rather, they take the risk of contagion, where individual parts of the movement act as part of another one, engaging with another in an ongoing process where the movement is in formation. You don't have the movements formed, but it's a process of formation. And everyone's ability to take political action can be strengthened, and specific interests can be brought together in new combinations, and some kind of solidarity can flourish. This was possible because, in addition to many young people supporting the movement, numerous local initiatives, left-wing groups, and grassroots trade unions organizations became part of the movement from the very beginning. This has also revived and reoriented the practice of organizing within the old left-wing movements, the unions, the left-wing political parties. The Tahir generation is coming into contact with the Seattle generation and with those of the old new social movements and the workers' movement. The mobilization is running through every group regardless of age. Given the organic nature of the cooperation, it makes little sense, at least in some countries, for instance Spain, to separate out different groups. And they extend far beyond the activists themselves. Millions of people now can see that they could stand up and oppose the status quo. millions of people who had never engaged in politics before, or who no longer expected to achieve anything from this kind of political stuff, are now getting involved and are protesting. This has created a momentum that is not so much a new social movement of the kind that is defined in poor sociological terms as against nuclear power or for better education or whatever. This is a social mobilization as such. Once the squares were cleared, people built on this kind of organic cooperation developed during the occupations and changed their strategy in a way that they secured the movement's survival. It scattered into the neighborhoods without dissipating. From there, the mobilization was able to expand and begin addressing specific problems by fighting, for instance, evictions in Spain or the US, building active solidarity networks for healthcare and food, like in Greece, providing direct aid in the wake of disasters like Occupy Sandy in the US, or taking collective action or organizing strikes in the public sector, like the wave of protests in Spain or the fight for the broadcaster in Greece. This kind of molecular organizing, which has been happening in numerous different places at the same time, has no center of organization. But it is organized. It's not spontaneous only. It builds on coordination and of connective mediating structures. Inter-neighborhood commissions, such as those in Spain, and other sometimes internet-based links organize the coordination between local groups, between the various specialized groups and other initiatives. People meet and share information at countless assemblies and meetings. Sometimes difficult to follow up because it's so many meetings. The different campaigns are coordinated among themselves and with the mass demonstrations and general strikes. Not every time, but very often. But despite all this, it remains incredibly difficult to keep the mobilization going. It is being shattered at the bastions of transnational power. Fragments of the movements are dissipating once again, and wide-reaching national ties, such as those created by Occupy Wall Street, are being torn apart. They doesn't exist anymore. Everywhere, the movement has new strategic tasks to address. So some short examples now are hopefully not too superficial. As well known, Tunisia's revolution brought Islamic groups to power that had not been part of the uprising. So far, neither Tunisia's unions, nor its old left-wing and liberal organizations, nor the numerous new networks and circles of the new movements have been able to formulate an organizational response to the power held by the Ennahda party. The movement needs to work out how to extend beyond specific urban groups to reach to the majority in rural areas and incorporate them into an alternative project. Furthermore, the polarization between the so-called Islamists and the so-called secularists obstructs the social question, the poverty, and the lack of prospects that triggered the revolution in the first place. Oppositionists like the left-wing politicians Mohamed Brahimi are being murdered while the process of revolution stagnates. The work of the Constituent Assembly has been suspended, and the National Salvation Front, an alliance of oppositional parties, is criticizing the government for its mismanagement and current stalemate and is urging it to step down. The most influential unions within the Tunisian General Labor Union are trying to act as some kind of mediators, and it seems to work out, at least, so that elections will be held at the end of this year. But it remains to be seen whether the opposition can secure some kind of majority or at least reach a point where it's really a counterpower to the Ennahda. The polarization caused by Morsi's authoritarian regime in Egypt drove the reorganization of the revolutionary movement forward, but here without losing sight of the unanswered questions of poverty and economic deprivation. The Tamrod, or rebel movement, addressed the self-inflicted paralysis in the alliance of left-wing and liberal groups and parties and succeeded in remobilizing opposition to Morsi's government. On the 30th of June 2013, 6 months of impressive activity and organization culminated in mass demonstrations that were described as being able to scare any party in government and any ruling class. When the Egyptian army under General al-Sisi removed Morsi from office, it prevented economic collapse and a possible civil war, but also impeded the revolution to go on. That was maybe the main focus. A possible victory of the opposition might have called the army's political and economic power into question. But large sections of the population welcomed this kind of Bonapartist coup because it overthrew the common Islamic enemy. Do they expect that this strike against reactionary religious groups will support the revolution by weakening the Muslim Brotherhood? During the short time that Morsi was in office, the army already improved its standing as the guardian of the nation. The army even gained credibility when it staged the coup, many chanting again, "The army and the people are one hand." That was one chant during the revolution. This time very tactical and clever, but now some kind of problematic. Its brutality of the army and the hundreds who have lost their lives demonstrated the authoritarian side of the military. Egypt's emergency law, which was one of the targets of the 2011 revolution, has been reinforced. So the coup was actually directed against the goals of the revolution, and the army is seeking to restore some kind of civil military rule. It seems that al-Sisi is not especially interested in the army playing a mediatory or protective role of the democratic playing field. Rather, he is aiming to seize power by reorganizing the civilian branch of the military and putting himself at the top. This process could build on a neo-Nazarist ideology that incorporates El-Baradei's liberals and Hamdan Sabahi's left-wingers, though without the pan-Arabist and without the socialist orientation of the old Nazarism. This means that the revolutionary groups are currently stuck between the repressed but mass Islamic movements and the renewed military regimes that incorporates even the left part of the, let's say, party organizations. The state's repressive measures and its curfews are making it hard to organize protests while the society is deeply divided. We can only hope that Sangur Sadran is right when he says that the revolutionaries and large parts of the subaltern are full of self-confidence and believe in their own strength after the events in 2011 and 2013. They are standing at the edge of the third phase of the revolution, a time of reorganizing the forces of the movement. We skip to Turkey after I've taken a small sip of water. In Istanbul, the AKP's increasingly authoritarian regime also led to a wave of protests, as you all know and have seen on television and internet or wherever. The unrest was triggered by a seemingly unremarkable matter: plans to cut down 5 trees in Gezi Park to make some way for retail development in the city centers at Taksim Square. Inspired by similar occupations around the world, Occupy Gezi, as some call it, was also an empty signifier that allowed people to express their discomfort and dissatisfaction. Here again, it was not the usual suspects who gathered to make their voices heard, but a new generation of the urban precariat. They did, however, quickly earn the support of every other generation. It was astonishing to see so many older people involved in the demonstrations, and in particular taking care of the protesters. As had happened in other places, the gatherings in Taksim Square became a meeting place for previously isolated groups and stark cultural differences. These included disorganized, subcultural, let's say, post-political scene organized cadres, splinter groups, LGBT activists, old-time left-wingers, supporters of the Kemalist CHP party, and anti-capitalist movement, Muslims, an interesting group, to name just a few. The protests spread extremely quickly, partly thanks to the government's overly harsh repression. Sometimes it helps. Over the 10 days of resistance, 77 towns and cities held demonstrations and occupied squares in Turkey. The events were also a wake-up call for the opposition parties, in particular the Kemalist CHP and the left-wing Kurdish BDP. But the squares, like all the others, were cleared and the demonstrations quashed. Once again, the mobilization scattered into the neighborhoods. Public forums are being held in parks all over Istanbul, in other towns and cities throughout the country. The protest is being shifted into the everyday life, with things like fast-breaking meals held on the streets. It was really extremely nice to experience that. Cocktails against Erdogan, I like that very much, especially against his anti-alcohol legislation, although it is a really hard activity because you have to drink so much. Innovative rallies, an explosion in street art, or a wedding with gas masks in Gezi Park. The forums in the park and via social networks are creating a space for discussing how to reorient and reorganize the mobilization. Given that the government is deeply anchored in large sections of the population, especially in rural areas, how can the movement maintain its momentum? Some dream of founding a new political party. As we had in Slovenia, it's already on the way. But given the heterogeneity of the movement in Turkey, this would surely be an overly hasty move. A much more promising approach is to focus on the upcoming municipal elections. A lot will depend on whether the meetings create a scope for forming new alliances between the movements, the old party structures, let's say, and the different streams and currents of the left. The crucial factor in this is the future relationship between the two opposition groups with the greatest numbers behind them, the still staunchly nationalist Kemalists and the Kurdish movement. Perhaps thanks to the momentum generated by Gezi, it will be possible to agree on a common candidate nominations in the various neighborhoods. Perhaps it will also mean that the popular left-wing politician Suriya Önder, a member of the BDP who was injured in the Gezi Park protests, will have a chance at winning the general mayoral elections in Istanbul. Abdullah Öcalan, who is still a key point of reference in the Kurdish movement, is advising to overcome skepticism and open the Kurdish forces for the protest movement. He has even gone so far as to recommend thinking about dissolving the old party, something which was really astonishing for many members of the BDP, so that it can fully engage with the reformation of the left in general. The left is trying to form an overarching platform, the People's Democratic Congress, that includes the BDP and 15 other parties and organizations. It began 2 years ago, but the momentum created by the protest has probably improved the conditions for success. Nevertheless, the People's Congress not only needs to overcome the fragmentation of the political left, but also find a way to organically integrate the interests and political models, the new forms of organizing that exist in the protest movement. In other words, instead of seeing itself as some kind of representative of the movement, the People's Congress must be a place where it is co-organized, a sort of institutional backbone that maintains close ties to the public forums in the neighborhoods. The People's Congress has founded a party, the People's Democratic Party, so that it could participate in the municipal elections, and at the same time this will allow the Congress to continue to function as a platform, not a party, while the party and the BDP can field common candidates for Western and Eastern Turkey, respectively, in the next elections. This is less about reaching the headquarters of power than about actually winning back effective forms of organization, institutional anchors in the municipalities where there was no such thing at all, except from some Kurdish areas. So this is to re-establish organization. Coming back to Southern Europe. The successful mobilizations in Spain, Portugal, also Greece, led, among other things, as you all know, to right-wing governments, pursuing brutal austerity policies, cutting labor and social rights, and pressing ahead with privatizations. Mass protests are on the order of the day. General strikes and large-scale demonstrations are attracting millions of people, with over a quarter of Portugal's entire population coming out onto the streets. If you compare this to Germany, then you have to think about 20 million on the streets to come to the same level as a mobilization in Portugal, for instance. Unimaginable, at least in Germany. Surveys also suggest that the protests enjoy enormous support and approval from the rest of the population. And beyond seeing themselves as horizontal, direct democratic alliances or something like that, they also have a representative function with much more vigor than the parties can muster. Most newspapers are filled with articles denouncing the Troika and its imperialist policies, the incompetence of their own governments, and soaring levels of corruption. Especially Spain's ruling right-wing proto-fascist Partido Popular has become entangled in corruption of unprecedented proportions, and support for the government has sunk to a record low. In Portugal, the Constitutional Court has rejected the government's austerity plans several times. The country's ruling right-wing coalition keeps reshuffling itself again and again to avoid falling apart. An anti-government stance is even starting to build within the military and the police. So the current situation is bringing back memories of the 1974 revolution, and every demonstration rings out with the old protest songs, especially Grandola, but I will not sing it right now because it's just boring. Yet false hopes are out of the question. Both governments have been severely weakened, but they show no signs of falling. Transnational power is holding them up straight. An authoritarian neoliberal constitutionalism within Europe is dispensing the need for consensus and democratic standards, and is governing with the help of ruling classes that are regressing to the days of the comprador bourgeoisie, quite literally selling their countries out. Somebody spoke today about the comprador bourgeoisie, I can't remember. In Spain, the movements are trying to reorient themselves. It is no longer enough to conquer civil society, occupy the squares, take over the streets, stage symbolic actions, prevent evictions, and win citizens' initiatives, even on a legislative level. Instead, now they are focusing on a proceso disconstituyente, a disconstitutive process, I don't know if this is English, but maybe you understand, which aims to overthrow the government and dissolve parliament. A lot of people are starting to think that seizing institutional power is important again. But then, of course, there's also a big part of the movement that wants nothing to do with it. So that's the struggle inside the movement. The fight for the headquarters of power will determine the future of the movements. Their efforts are not so much about reorganizing a new kind of party as about forming a Frente Cívico, a kind of civic front, maybe comparable to what you said, Luca, about Niki Vendola factories, but without a Niki. I think it's a good idea, but because they does not aim to govern the country. The crucial factor here is whether the different elements of the movements, the unions, the Izquierda Unida, and the regional left-wing nationalist parties can achieve some shared strategic goals. In its latest manifesto, the 15M movement, along with other sections of the broad social mobilization, promotes starting a constituent process from below. The process is linked to the movement's models of horizontal and diagonal consulting and organizing in the neighborhoods and regions at the national and perhaps in the future at a European level. Instead of seizing executive power, the social mobilization, in theoretical terms, the constituent power, aims to re-establish the social institutions, the constituted power. But so far, this process seems to be making little headway. Portugal will hold municipal elections soon, and maybe next elections, general elections, in June 2014. But it remains unclear what should happen if the government is toppled. What could be? The Communist Party, the Left Bloc, and the Socialist Party have no prospect of forming a joint government. The alternative civil society processes are not properly developed. Beyond the impressive demonstrations, organizational structures behind are lacking. Always the same 50 people that organize all this stuff. You all know them by name. So again, it's a problematic between the huge and impressive effect of demonstrations and a lack of organization, both on civil society and on the institutional level. Coming to Greece, and here Panagiotis will stop me if I say something completely stupid. He will talk about that tomorrow too. Greece government has also been weakened. The leftist social democratic power Dima pulled out of the coalition in response to the surprise closure of the state broadcaster and to the mass protest that followed. That has left the government with a wafer-thin majority in parliament. It is very likely that a new round of fighting and strikes, combined with the lack of an economic upturn, will plunge the remaining coalition made up of the conservative Nea Demokratia and the social democratic PASOK into severe difficulties. If the current coalition were hit by another crisis that triggered a fresh round of elections, it would raise the question of whether a left-wing Syriza-led government might be voted in. As things stand, Nea Demokratia and Syriza are neck and neck in the polls. PASOK is down at, I think, around 7% right now, I don't know, which means that Nea Demokratia is in danger of losing its coalition partner, though Syriza would also be on the lookout for one. Syriza acts as a kind of concentration point. It builds on the many civil society activities involved in self-organizing and protesting, combines them, or tries to combine and translate them into real prospects for getting into power in a really short term. And yet the scope for taking action within the existing institutions is likely to be very, very tiny. There is little chance of the Troika or the international financial markets losing their grip. Quite the opposite. Syriza knows very well that it is impossible to seize power without changing the world or produce some kind of rupture. A potential left-wing government is wedged between authoritarian European constitutionalism and the bureaucratic apparatus powered by PASOK and Nea Demokratia's clientelism since, I don't know, so many years, and must reckon with capitalist measures driving the country even deeper into economic crisis when such a government will appear. It will not be enough to reject and renegotiate the memorandum, introduce capital controls, continue developing a comprehensive program for the government, if there is not a fundamental challenge of the status quo, if there's no new institutions that are created, then even a left government would have no chance at all. The government would have to refuse to govern on a traditional basis immediately. But how to do such a thing, to get into government and refuse to govern? It's a kind of crazy thing. For this to happen, an emergency program should immediately be combined with a rupture that brings large sections of the population together in a process of collective reorganization and constitutive reinvention of institutions, circumventing or reforming the old institutions. Otherwise, it's not possible to simply take the state as a tool or something like that. That brings us to the Spanish question of how to combine a destitutive process with a constitutive process. The 8 networks, organizational processes that are based on solidarity have created the civil society hubs needed for this to happen. However, it remains unclear whether this will be enough to support a left-wing government during a crisis-plagued transition, because that is absolutely clear. If there's some kind of left government, that will be an ever deeper crisis. There's also a need for strong international solidarity, and similar processes in other countries. There's no such thing just like a rupture in one country. Last point. I have 4 last points. Yeah. The transnational question. I'll make it very short, leaving ahead a lot of things. Struggles in Europe are back again, but European coordination of the struggle proves to be extremely difficult. Not only on a, let's say, party level, especially dramatic is the situation on European Union level, although there was some kind of first common general strike, at least in Southern Europe and France and some other places, without any effect in Germany. That's one of the big problems. Even the Indignados, Occupy movements, Syntagma and so forth are struggling to coordinate their protests across Europe. But of course, we are all thinking about what could be a concentration point for a transnational form of organizing. One point in the next year might be the opening of the new European Central Bank building in Frankfurt and the corresponding round of bloc-occupy protests, which could take an important symbolic role, let's say. Even more important than the protests themselves is the process of organizing them, which could create a regular transnational space for discussing joint strategies and actions. Also, national and European debt audits, bottom-up constitutive processes and things like that are still on the agenda among relevant parts of the movements, though efforts to create the necessary momentum for them have so far failed. As important as these issues are, the majority is more passionate about addressing the everyday struggles of a precarious life, struggles for individual and social reproductions, like we heard in the last panel. Healthcare, education, care, food, and especially housing. The fight against evictions, displacement, and neoliberal urban restructuring plays a crucial role in every mobilization, from Istanbul, Berlin, or Detroit to Madrid, and you told me that even in some parts of Austria, Steiermark, with the Communist Party, it plays an important role. In Spain, the anti-eviction organization is an institutional and strategic backbone for the whole mobilization, so important it has become. And they have chalked up some substantial initial successes. Even in Germany, mobilizations against evictions and fresh initiatives are hopeful signs from a country that does not have especially active protest conjuncture due to its position in the crisis management, as you all know, the winners of the crisis and things like that. How can these local struggles be linked together in a transnational network? The next joint days of action are a start to try to at least discuss these stronger ties. But what is needed is a disconstitutive process, an effective break with the status quo also on the European Union level. But it is unlikely that this will happen at the transnational level right away. And at the same time, people can't wait in the crisis economies. So we can't wait for the good Europe to come to have a good kind of, let's say, social Europe or whatever. That strategy failed. So what to do? To be clear, transnational organizing is desirable, but it will probably only be facilitated or even created by an event that results in maybe just 1 or 2 countries producing that kind of rupture. This might be a left-wing government in Greece that rejects the Troika's austerity policies, calls for fresh negotiations, debt audit, introduces capital controls, etc., etc. Politicians have to take the risk of violating European Union guidelines to opt out, what the Britons always do. They opt out from so many regulations. Why not opt out in a progressive way, let's say? Create some kind of progressive economic zones or whatever. Others will follow and take the risk. And the next step will to be expand these kind of unilateral reforms, which have already begun in one or more countries throughout Europe. As things stand, however, it seems that only Greece seems to have a realistic chance of this to start, and the transnational power bloc is doing all what is possible to isolate this kind of stance. Maybe Spain has also a chance to, if they bring down this weak government without installing a new government. That would be a new situation for creating this space for a constitutive process and for rupture. Given that the governments in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy could well fall, some say also in Slovenia, a possible alliance of the southern left is starting to seem some kind of realistic. Such an alliance would be obviously not be limited to the radical left, movements or parties. It would also be an opportunity for social democracy to lift itself out of the dire straits it is currently in. If combined with widespread mobilization and organizing in Europe, this national, transnational approach to change the relations of forces of power and to question existing institutions can open up new horizons, because in the existing framework of institutions, it will be extremely difficult or nearly impossible to reach any progressive step. The molecular transnational organizing from the local to the European level has at least begun to prepare the ground for this to happen. Maybe I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we have time, excuse me, time for debate, 20 minutes to 25 minutes. 20 to 25 minutes for questions and comments.
Somewhat obvious question, what about Germany?
Just a short one. When you talk about civil society, do you also include trade unions into civil society, or trade unions would be like out of that concept?
Only short ones.
I have one comment and one question. First of all, question about Portugal. What is the role of the left bloc and the green-red coalition in Portugal? Because as in comparison with other countries, there are two parliamentary left parties in Portugal parliament, as I know. And the second remark or comment is on your remark on Great Britain. Well, the difference between Great Britain and all other these Southern European countries is that agreement between the United Kingdom during the Thatcherite government and European Union made this option to exclude themselves from certain trajectories in European Union policies. On the other side, Greece and other Southern European countries cannot have these options. That is the difference between the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe.
Should I? Yeah. This German question. Of course, we have worked a lot about that, but let's say Germany is not the place for the next revolution right now. That's a simple answer. The complicated answer is that at least we have some kind of stabilized the left. The movements quite lively, but extremely fragmented. And a party that was in a dramatic situation a year ago now seems to have some kind of stabilized, but it's extremely difficult to organize in Germany right now because the crisis management was extremely clever. As you all know, big parts of the German economy is based on exports. More than ever before, about 50% of the GDP is on exports. That means that big parts of the unions are integrated in a new crisis corporatism that is working very well. And even if the precarization has risen in the last 10 years in numbers like in no other country happened in such a short time, with the crisis, people are some kind of happy that at least they keep their jobs, even if they are shitty. More than 2/3 of the new jobs created are precarious jobs. And as you all know, more than 7 million people in Germany work beyond the poverty line, things like that. But you always hear that if you look at the other countries, yeah, we're quite stable. Or would you like to have Greek situation? So, and this kind of racist turning around from, you see how the Greek run the economy, or these kind of crazy Italians, and so at least Mother Merkel is organizing these things in a way that is some kind of stable, and that makes it difficult to organize. And there is real incorporation, and that's for the unions, especially in the export sectors, it's some kind of rationale to say, okay, if we get short-term working benefits, if we get the new programs for buying new cars and things like that, if we get more collective bargaining, things like that, they will be stupid to say no to this kind of, but that integrates them and fragments the left in a way. So this already brings to the second question. Unions, in this sense, are part of the state at the momentum crisis corporatism. But of course, they're also part of civil society when they organize the rank and file, when they organize on other questions like pensions and whatever. So they are both like political parties that have to organize civil society, have to organize their members, neighborhoods, whatever, but in fact are always part of the parliamentary system of the state. So the notion of the integral state from Gramsci makes very much sense to see it not as separate fields, but as interconnected ones. And this is true for all the civil society organizations that I was mentioning. Portugal, the parties of the left right now seem to be quite stable, but of course in the turn of the crisis was going up and down, especially the bloc, while the Communist Party was quite stable on a relatively low level. But as you know, cooperation is extremely difficult, like Syriza and Kukuē, you know better than me. So on the party level, there is no chance at the moment to get momentum in any way. But again, without the stable organization of the movements, what should even a new left coalition in government should do? Because these huge demonstrations are really going up and down in Portugal. So you can't build an alternative project on such a conjuncture. That's one of the problems that is seen in all the mobilization, it's all the movements right now, that the organizational question comes back. And it's not just together at the squares and talk about blah, 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 blah. That's extremely important. It was the entering of this new cycle. But what to do then? It's the next step. And even if you get the organizations or civil society grounds, like in Spain. It's really impressive how many stable organizations developed. But if you just stay on this grounds of civil society without reaching out to the institutions, again, you're stuck. And that is the debate right now, how to reach out without just falling into the trap of the old, we take the power and then we make everything else differently. On Great Britain opting out, yes, of course it was a specific historical situation, but why not use again? In the moment, the European framework is a kind of puzzle of opting out things, because many countries only adopt several things, others. So it is already a puzzle. So why not say we do it with free flow of capitals? No, we don't want that anymore. We opt out. What should European Union do if Greece, Spain, or whatever say, no, we opt out? Throw them out of the European Union? No, they can't. Throw them out of the euro? That would break down the euro. So there is some kind of power to renegotiate on such a level. But of course, that means that you have to have this, stable is the wrong word, but this kind of powerful roots in civil society and on an institutional level. Otherwise, it will be swept away.
Thank you. We have a question. In fact, two questions.
I would like to continue on Jovica's question, because I believe that maybe, I mean, it was a nice overview of the movements in Europe and elsewhere, but I think you maybe take the whole trade union question a bit too lightly. First of all, of what you definitely mentioned in your presentation is that there was a general strike last year, which was coordinated on the European level, and of course I agree with you that it didn't really do much. It was in a way it went under the radar, and most of the media never really touched on it and so on. But so its reach is really limited. But what really happened with that general strike is actually that it was the first time in, I believe, trade union history that something like that was coordinated on the international level, European level, and that it actually had some success in that sense. Trade unions, especially in the form that they exist for the last 50, 60 or maybe more years, have never even tried, let alone achieve anything like that. So that's the first thing with the concrete general strike that you were speaking about. The second thing is that it was also the first time that they changed their rhetoric from the whole, social, three parties in the discussion and so on. They changed it to against the austerity measures and so on. It was the first time that they, at the highest level of international trade union organizations, they had the agreement, at least a loose kind of agreement, that the austerity was a problem, and that the reason that they are going into general strike is to fight what is happening in the European Union. What I do definitely agree with you is that the Germany's problem in the whole sense, because, for example, France trade unions striked also in Spain, even in Croatia. We had at least support, of course, in a way nominal support, but trade unions supported, and because they are part of the Central and so on. The German trade unions, as I know it, never participated in it, and that's also probably to the extent British and so on. So the problem is not so much that the trade union movement is as you maybe presented it, is part of is part of the state institutions. I believe the thing is the other way around. They are just now trying to form some concrete response to the crisis. It's extremely slow process, even slower than the mass movement processes, which always get really tangled up in creating some form of response. But the trade unions have some organizational structure that and resources that have the chance to influence the politics on the European level, and so the thing that's happening with those negotiations among the international trade unions is, of course, really hard and slow. But that doesn't mean that it won't produce some results in future. What is definitely disappointing is that concrete general strike was the only thing that happened and nothing since. So I believe that we should not take the whole trade union question so lightly. At least maybe if something in Germany shifted, then the whole thing would be much more strong, and we wouldn't have this discussion.
Well, I think that you described and you analyzed the importance of this new cycle, and we have to admit that this is a new cycle, the cycle that opened in, let's say, 2010, 2011. I think that it is a cycle of, in a way, of an insurrectionary character. I think that you described how important it is, how it brings together different segments of society, both those that with a tradition of militancy and struggle, and those that until now did not participate in struggles, and it brought them together in a very material and symbolic situation, exemplified in the squares all over the world. It's also good that it's still going on. I think that the events of this summer, both in Turkey and despite the contradictions in Egypt, meant that this dynamic is far from, the cycle is far from over. But I think that this brings up the question of the organizing question, the question of organization, because it's interesting that many people have evoked 1848, a dynamic that is not transformed into politically in an autonomous way. And can also be defeated. And I think this is also the danger here. We need to find ways to translate it politically, and for lack of better political vehicles, I think that we should use the existing parties, but they have to of the left, but they have to reinvent themselves. Until now, we do not have this process. Even in Greece, I will try to explain this tomorrow, we are far from that. Even in Greece, which perhaps it is the only case where you have an analogy between a mass popular mobilization and an impressive rise of the left. But still, we do not have those kinds of political parties or fronts all over Europe that can translate these movements. And I think part of the problem is that we still think in terms of representing these movements, of representing their dynamic, whereas we need to learn from these movements by becoming part of these movements, at the same time trying to incorporate them in, to use the Gramscian metaphor, in an organic way. And this also is important in regards to the question of power, because we need political power. It is obvious that without political power, things can only get worse. Not if there's, in a post-democratic condition, it's not that social mobilization shifts political power and governance towards the demands of the movement. It happens the other way around. It becomes more authoritarian because it can offer no consensus. So we need power, but still we need power. It's not just a question of how to make all these people vote for us. It's not just simple. I think it demands a way to realize that we need to offer an alternative version of power and governance so as to actually attract these people, and this requires thinking of these forms of organization not in an instrumental way. This is not just the movement and now comes the question of power. These movements in their very material performativity represent alternative configurations of power. These are, to use an analogy, the forms of dual power of today, not only in the sense of a counterpower, but also in the sense that they are actually experimenting with how to organize things, how to produce things, how to create, to offer solutions. And unless the left becomes a learning process, we will miss this chance of actually creating this kind of bond between the movement and left-wing political representation. That is the only way towards political power and transformation.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. To the first question on the general strikes or the comment. Yes, I agree, but two points. If we look, for instance, at Spain, the pressure from the union rank and file people from below, who, with the 15M movement, went directly to the squares and tried to organize and combine this with new forms of strike. They made a huge pressure on a union, or on the unions, the two big ones, that were still, although there was already an austerity program from the socialist government, still dreaming of a social compact. So again, unions are part of the state in a typical cooperative way, and organize a part of the civil society organizing there. The pressure from below lead to a reorientation of the whole unions in Spain. Of course, also the ongoing austerity programs and the pressure, especially from the conservative or proto-fascist government. But when the Popular Party offered a new social compact, again there was a discussion from the head of the unions, oh, maybe we should do that and secure some rights, some labor rights, social rights and things like that. Of course you have to rethink that if this is a rational situation, but I think nobody had the sense that this is a good idea. So it was very contested inside the unions, and they did it. It was a good point. But there's always the danger of being integrated, because those in power, they do and they will try to break out parts of the movements and to integrate them in material terms with a social compact or whatever. And they did it in Germany. And that's why for so long the European Trade Union Confederation was not working, because the interests of the member associations were so completely different. The situations in the countries not comparable, so they didn't come to common action. And then that was really historical that they agreed on this general strike. But again, the German unions doesn't oppose it, but they didn't take part. There was not even a demonstration, a very tiny demonstration of 100 people in Germany. So again, it was because not they were stupid or traitors or whatever, because their situation is so differently. So again, there was a split. Now then, some parts of the union, like Verdi, the service union, and the German Confederation, started to invent some kind of programs for refounding Europe or the European Marshall Plan. And right now we are trying to organize with the unions and with the ECB if the unions from the South could concretize this overall Marshall Plan. I don't think it's a good name, but whatever. It's a good approach from German unions to say, okay, we have to find some kind of common ground for the crisis in the whole of Europe, not only for the export industry in Germany. And we're trying to, I don't know if this is a good idea, but with the water services, it worked. The European, how is it called? The European Citizens Initiative that worked somehow well with the water services. So the European Commission stepped back, and now it's the plan if another European citizens initiative should be started to press the Marshall Plan. At least so the European Commission should discuss that thing. That is only a good idea if you use it to organize the discussions around the European unions. That is a good idea. I don't know. I don't think that European Commission has any would adopt this, even if it's a majority signed the European Citizens Initiative. But of course, there are things running, things becoming better, especially because Germany is trying to organize strikes in their own field again, much more than in the former times. And with new, innovative, and especially female strikes, as I said in the panel before, that is a good sign, because if we are able to fight for labor rights, better wage conditions and things like that in Germany, that will lower the competitive pressure on all the other economies. So that is also a kind of working together. But still, it is extremely difficult, and I don't see the biggest union, the IG Metall, that was once a left. It's still a left union, but it's so deeply integrated in the crisis corporatism that this will be a long struggle. To Panagiotis, I agree with everything you said. Again, here is the danger of fragmentation if we don't succeed to reinvent the parties and the civil society organizations in a way, and how they work together. The problem is that if you look at Greece and Portugal, we already said there are several parties that fragmented, while the movements try to come together and really succeed. In Spain right now, they are forming a new party instead of reinventing Izquierda Unida, what they're also doing. And there are several regional, nationalist, separatist parties gaining momentum. And what a year ago with the Catalan 15M movement was really a good development to say, no, that's a question of class, not of nations, how to organize against the transnational power and things like that. That's swept away with this, fucking reorientation to, no, we want our national left, progressive, alternative, whatever. That's breaking up what was reached in 2 years or 3 years of organizing. It's really a danger. It's a bit different in other parts where also national parties from the left are reorganizing, but not in contrast to the rest of the Spanish movements and of the European movements. But especially in the Catalan area right now, it is a real danger of frustrating the whole momentum that was reached since years.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. If not, then I thank you for your questions and comments, and I thank Mario, and we'll see you tomorrow, 10 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
And I sent them the papers if somebody would read it, because it was very fast.
Yeah, and just another small info. The sessions tomorrow will be at the Faculty of Philosophy, or Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so we are not in the Goethe-Institut tomorrow, but just down the street. If you don't know how to find it, check Google Maps. Thank you.